search is absolutely critical to a successful SharePoint deployment. And that's what we want to start to take a look at over the next series of lessons is SharePoint search. What we're going to start off with in this lesson is the basics of SharePoint search, the behind the scenes components and moving parts that are all going to come together to give us that search implementation, and we're going to finish it off with a real quick demo of how to go in and create our search service application. Now, don't worry, we are going to get in a little bit later, taking a look at how to configure SharePoint search on both the back end as well as on the front end, and how we can help customize the experience that our users are going to see with search. When deploying SharePoint, it's not uncommon, and in fact, really, it's the norm to have millions of items that users are going to want to be able to access. Now, these items could, of course, be inside of SharePoint, but they may also be external to SharePoint. One of the biggest needs that SharePoint solves in corporations and organizations is the need to have a central portal that I go to one spot, and from that one spot, I can find all the information that I'm looking for. Now, when you're dealing with that large of an amount of data, being able to set up some form of a structure where users are always going to be able to successfully navigate and find the information that they're looking for is, well, basically impossible, that you're just not going to be able to do it. That at some point or another, users are going to have to search. In fact, you're going to find quite frequently that users are going to prefer search over just simply navigating for what they want. And a lot of that's just simply because of, well, the fact that we've been dealing with large amounts of data for quite a while now. And in fact, if you go to any application, be it Outlook, Windows, or otherwise, you notice that search is pervasive. Basically, everywhere you go, there's going to be some form of a readily accessible search menu. And SharePoint is, of course, no exception. Let's talk a bit about SharePoint search. SharePoint search has multiple components that are going to come together to make the magic happen. Now, chances are, if you're watching this, you probably have some level of experience with search in SharePoint 2007 and in SharePoint 2010. Now, a lot of the different components and features and otherwise that you learned in 2007 that you learned in 2010 carry forward into 2013. In fact, you're going to notice that a lot of the screens that we've been using haven't changed really since SharePoint 2007, because on the whole, SharePoint search was done very well, even all the way back into 2007. You're going to notice that there were some subtle changes going into 2010, and while there are some significant changes going into 2013, a lot of that is behind the scenes, and a lot of that is for the front end. But a lot of the major components are still the same. That the way that I always like to explain this is that just enough has changed to be confusing. I would also mention that if you're familiar with fast search, a lot of the different concepts that you're going to see in here are what we've seen in fast search before. Let's roll through all the different components that are going to operate behind the scenes to make the search magic happen inside of SharePoint. The first major component that we're going to have is our crawl component. Now, for those of you not familiar with the concept of crawling, crawling in a nutshell is just simply a system going off, finding an item, getting it, and getting it ready to eventually be indexed and eventually be searched. Now, one of the big things to keep in mind about crawling, and we'll get more into this as we get into performance a little bit later, is the fact that this is really nothing more than a system going off and requesting an item. It's basically just as if a client came along and requested a document, requested a SharePoint item. And so as a result, there is going to be some potential load for whatever systems are going to be crawled. Now, the way that you're going to identify to the crawl component what it is that you want crawled is by going in and listing locations inside of content sources. And as we're going to see later, content sources can be created to serve my needs as long as each content source that I create utilizes the same type of document source or item source and uses the same schedule. The next component that we have is the content processing component. Now this is going to be very different for those of you that have worked with SharePoint 2010. In SharePoint 2010, the crawl component was responsible for not only grabbing the item, but busting the item open, getting the metadata, and sending all that information to the appropriate components and databases behind the scenes. That has now been split off. And in fact, this sort of now resembles a little bit of 2007. For those of you familiar with 2007, you remember that we had an index server that was responsible for actually parsing all the data, and it told the crawl servers what to go get. It's a very similar concept once again here, that we've got a separate call component that's responsible for going off and getting our data, and then we've got our content processing component that's responsible for actually opening up that data, finding the metadata, reading the documents, and generating the artifacts that will eventually be used once we go off and do our search. So our crawl component responsible for going off getting the items, our content processing component responsible for busting open those items. Now the content processing component is going to generate a couple of different artifacts. The first artifact is the information that it's going to be sending off to the index component. And this is going to be the different properties. This is going to be performing what's known as entity extraction, or basically automatic properties, where it can detect certain keywords and automatically highlight those as people or as companies' locations. And it will also handle all of our linguistics processing as well. The other component that it's going to generate is going to be the link database. The link database is going to contain our URLs, and it's going to contain information about where our data is, in particular in relation to where that data happens to be to other data, to our favored authoritative sources, and even some degree of social networking as well. Now that link database is going to be utilized by the analytics processing component. The whole goal of our analytics processing component is to determine what the value is of the data based on usage. And it will perform a couple of different types of analytics. It's going to do our search analytics and our usage analytics. Now our search analytics is going to include things like anchor text, where if I create a link to an item and I do a search based on a keyword, and that keyword happens to exist inside of that link, then what's going to happen is it's going to highlight or move up in my result set the document that that item points to. It's also going to utilize click distance. So how close is one item compared to another item or compared to where I currently am? It's also going to do things like depth, so that the deeper that an item is inside of a folder structure, chances are the less important that it is. The higher up that it is, chances are the more important that it is. So it can help reorganize our search results based on that information. It's also going to do this based on social distance. So if I list somebody as a colleague and somebody else lists them as a colleague, then what could wind up happening is it could detect that relationship and go, hey, you know this person created this item, we might want to move that up. Or you know this person knows that other person created an item, we might want to move that up maybe just a scotch, just a little bit there. And then it's also going to be responsible for handling our search reports as well, which we're going to be able to utilize later on when we're trying to figure out how to best optimize our search environment. Now it's also going to analyze our usage statistics. So things like how often an item is accessed, how much activity a particular item winds up getting on edit, for example, and if somebody has gone in and recommended or highly rated certain items, then all of that is going to be part of the analytics that this is going to generate as well. And we can also actually access that analytics data through reports as well. We also have an index component. Now, our index component is going to be the system that will actually be handling the eventual queries. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to take all the processed items that it got from the content processing component and write this out to the index file on disk. Now, that index file that it's going to write out onto disk is basically the database that's going to be used for searching. One of the very big things that we want to do with that index file is make sure that we move that index file off to a dedicated disk to help improve performance. That basically the way that I like to treat that is about the same way that I would a database. So I want to make sure that the server itself has as much processing and memory power as possible, and that I/O is optimized for wherever it is that we're going to be storing our index file. Now, with our index component, we have the ability to create partitions and replicas. Now, partitions simply allow us to take our index and divide that up across multiple locations. And that can help improve performance. That basically what's going to happen is one partition is going to be responsible for one portion of the index file, another partition is going to be responsible for another portion. So that way when I execute a query, my query will be spread across both partitions, and that will help improve the performance of my query. We can also set up replicas. Replicas are just simply copies. Now that can actually do two things for us. One of the things that it could do for us is help give us high availability. So if one goes down, the other one can then take over. It's also going to, once again, help improve performance. So that way, if we have a geographically dispersed environment, or maybe we just simply want to be able to divide the load up between a couple of different servers, then we can create replicas. So that way we can make sure that all of our queries are going to be spread out through a couple of different servers. We've got our partitions, which will take the data, split that up into different locations, and our replicas, which will take the same data and just make copies of that, so that way we can load balance between the different environments. And then the last main component that we have is our query component. Now the query component is responsible for taking the query from the web front-end user, parsing it, sending it off to the index component, getting the results, and then eventually getting the results ready to be sent back to the web front-end or the WFE. The big thing to keep in mind about SharePoint is that our web front end is what our users will always communicate with. And if they issue a query request, that query request is going to be sent back to the query component. My web front end is not going to forward the user to there. Now, not only does my query component take the query, pass that back to the index server, but it's also going to be responsible for analyzing the query and analyzing the result and sorting them and getting them ready for the user. So that way, if based on the user type, based on the user's location, I want to be able to highlight or demote certain items, I can do that, and it's the query component that will be responsible for handling that in the end. Now, as with everything in SharePoint, there is going to be reliance on databases, and search is certainly no exception. The databases that search is going to be creating is first up a crawl database. My crawl database is used by the crawl component to figure out what it is that it needs to crawl next. That any time that we go in and list a location inside of a content source, typically what we're going to do is we're just going to list off the parent and not all of the children. So what's going to happen is that my crawl component is going to go, okay, well now we've got the parent, let's go off and find everything else that needs to be crawled. Anytime that my crawl component goes off, crawls a location, and finds a brand new link, rather than crawling that link then and there, what it's going to do is it's going to add that to the crawl database, so that way the crawl component can go back and pick that up at a later point in time. We're going to have our link database, and the link database is going to store the location of all the different items, and it's going to store the raw usage information that eventually my analytics component is going to read, process, and then output to our analytics reporting database. The last main component that we have database-wise is the search administration database. There's only ever going to be one of these, and that's going to be responsible for holding all of the different ACLs and all the configuration for the overall search component. Now we've got a lot of different moving parts, and I think the best way to bring all of this home is to kind of show some different pictures and show the workflow that is going to take place for our crawling, our analytics, and our querying. Let's start off by taking a look at our crawl component. Now what you're going to notice here is that I've got everything laid out. We've got the crawl component up top. We've got our content processing component down below. We've got our crawl database, our index component, and our link database. Now, when crawling is about to take place, what our crawl component is going to do first is it's going to go talk to the crawl database and figure out what to crawl next. Now, the reason that we've got that centralized database is so that way we can have multiple crawl components. Because of the fact that we've got the one centralized database, as I add and remove crawl components as needed, all that they're ever going to do is keep talking to that centralized database. That centralized database knows what needs to be crawled, so basically our crawl components are stateless. They're not going to be storing any information. Now, once they get the link, they're then going to go off and contact whatever type of system it is that needs to be contacted. And this could be SharePoint. This could be an intranet web application. This could be Exchange public folders. It's going to go off, request the particular item, and then pass that item off to the content processing component. Now, my content processing component is going to bust open the item and find all the information that it can find. All the metadata and the corpus of the document itself is going to be sent off to the index component. The link location and where the item happens to be is going to be sent off to the link database. Any URLs that might be found are going to be sent off to the crawl database. Now, the next main component that we have is the analytics component. The analytics component is going to run as a separate process, and it's going to be responsible for contacting the link database, finding the information that it needs, processing it, and then passing it off to the analytics database so that way we can later run reports against it. And then finally, last but not least, is the actual querying. The way that querying is going to work is we've got our web front-end server. User's going to make a request to the web front end. The web front end is going to send that over to our query component. Our query component is going to analyze that, figure out what it is that we actually need to search for, send the search request off to the index component. The index component will then build up the results. It'll send it back to the query component. The query component will then reorganize as needed and then send the results back to the web front-end server. Because of the fact that SharePoint is going to be used quite heavily by your users, SharePoint allows you to scale search as needed. Now, one of the big things to keep in mind whenever you're talking about scaling, and this is going to be true universally, is that while there are certain rules of thumb, there are going to be no absolutes. So what I'm going to present to you here is a couple of different rules of thumb, but I want you to keep in mind that you will always need to go in and do testing in your environment and monitor your environment. Now, here's some general guidance. What you're going to notice is that if we're talking about less than 10 million items, as far as our index component, we want 2 components and 1 partition. Now, the reason that we want 2 components is really just for fault tolerance. So that way, if one goes down, the other can take over. As far as our query component, basically 2 will do us just fine up until we hit 80 million. More than 80 million, then we're going to want 4. So for less than 10 million, 1 will do us just fine. For our content processing, it's going to be Basically, 2 for each 50 million. So you'll notice that if we're less than 10, all we need is 2. Now, our analytics is going to vary a little bit, but generally speaking, if you're less than 10 million items, then you're going to go with just simply 2 analytic servers. As far as our crawl database, it's going to be 1 for 20 million. So if you're talking about less than 10 million items, 1 will do just fine for you. And then finally, our link database, where we're able to just simply have 1 per 60 million. So you'll notice with less than 10 million, all we need is 1. Now, if we step that up to between 10 and 40 million, then we should look at having 8 index components and 4 partitions. And the big reason that we want to step up to 8 index components is for the ability to be able to load balance all of our queries. And then 4 components so that way we can spread that across all the different locations. You'll notice, once again, that we don't need our new query component. For content processing, we're going to want 4 at this point. For analytics, we'll want 2. For our crawl databases, we're going to want 2. And for our link databases, just simply 1. And if you hit 100 million, you want 20 index components with 10 total partitions. You're going to want 4 query servers, 6 content processing, 6 analytics, 5 crawl databases, 2 link databases, and a partridge in a pear tree. Now, as far as everything else goes, all that you ever need is 2 crawl components, and that really is just for fault tolerance. You're going to want 2 search administration components, and again, just for fault tolerance. And then, like I mentioned before, the number of analytics databases is really going to depend on usage. So the components that I've shown up top are really going to vary for our analytics depending on our environment, the amount of information that we're going to be processing, how heavily all that information is going to be used, the amount of churn on that data, etc. Now, as far as dealing with performance issues goes, if you notice that you're getting relatively low crawl time, so it's taking a little while, or you're getting relatively low result freshness, then what you're going to want to consider doing is adding additional crawl databases and crawl components so that way we can go ahead and crawl that much faster. And we also want to consider adding content processing components so that way we can also, once we get the data, process it and send it off to our index server that much faster. Now, the best way to figure this out is take a look at the crawl health reports, and we'll talk about those a little bit more in a later lesson. If your queries, however, are slowing down, then what we'll need to do is one of a couple of different things. If we're talking about query latency, just simply that it takes a while to get the response back, then typically we just simply need to add replicas. But if we're talking about both latency and throughput, that we're simply running out of bandwidth to be able to send our information back and forth between the query server and the index server, then we're going to want to take a look at adding on additional partitions. Now, in a later lesson, we're going to take a look at how to manage this. But for right now, what I want to do is I want to get in and create the search component that we're going to use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Start, and I'm going to go to Central Administration. Now, search is simply a service application. So all that I need to do is click Manage Service Applications, and then I can hit New, and then Search Service Application. Now, I'm going to give this a name of SharePoint Search, and I'm going to let it use the service account for my crawling. Now, you'll notice that it needs 2 separate pools, one for the admin, and then one for our search query site settings. Now, if you want to create pools, you can do that. The one little thing that I'm going to mention is that if you decide that you're going to create a search pool, and you might decide to do something like this, let's say search pool and search pool. If I hit OK here, what would wind up happening is I'd get an error message. because it's going to try and create the application pool for me with the first one, and then when the second one comes along, it's going to wind up failing out. So it'll fail out the entire operation. It'll still create the application pool, but it'll fail out the operation. So what I would then have to do is go back and tell it to use that first one that had been created. Now in my case, because of the fact that I want to, as much as possible, share my application pools, I'm just going to tell it to use our web services application pool. And then I've got everything set up, and all I have to do is just simply hit OK. Now what this is going to do is this is going to create all of our default moving parts and all of our default components. Once this is done, you'll then have to go back and re-edit everything. Now keep in mind that this will take it a couple of moments. And so once this is done, we'll then be able to go in and manage our environment. But managing our environment, we're going to take a look at in the next lesson. I'll see you in the next lesson.